The old man opens with a person breaking into Dan Chase's home, but his pair of Rottweilers subdue the intruder. Dan tries to ask him who sent him, but the man isn't talking. The intruder was definitely there to do him harm. He'd seen him earlier in the day at a local coffee shop, and that drew Dan's attention because he knew he was being followed. Dan is an ex-CIA agent living off the grid for decades. He has been living out his later years with his 2 dogs in a small town, but memories of his past haunt him. Dan is not his real name. It's an alias, and he has many of them. At this point, Dan realizes he needs to run. So he gathers his stash of cash, IDs, and other helpful items, takes his dogs, and makes a run for it. We see that the CIA is the one that sent the man to Dan's home. They contact Harold Harper to help them pursue Dan because they have a past together. Dan stops at a diner on his way out of town, and he looks to be setting up a new life. While at the diner, Harold calls him and informs him that he isn't running this op, but he was brought in to consult. Dan believes the cell phone was clean and untraceable, but Harold tells him to look under his car, and when he does, he finds a transponder. Also, Harold tells him that his location can be reverse engineered from his cell phone while traveling with the transponder. Harold tells him that Dan doesn't understand how the game works anymore. He's too old and he's been out of it too long. Dan is told to move because they will be at his location in 3 minutes. We also learn in this conversation that Dan lost his wife a few years ago to Huntington's disease, which is a neurodegenerative disease that damages nerve cells in the brain. We also learn that Harold lost his son and daughter-in-law in a car accident, and he, along with his wife, are taking care of their child now. Harold informs Dan that he's currently looking at 12 highly trained field operatives who are instructed to take Dan alive and put him on a chartered plane. He doesn't know where the plane is going or why they need to take him alive, but it can't be good. Harold believes that Faraz Hamzad wants Dan taken back to Kabul, and he's finally convinced someone in the CIA to help him make that happen. Hamzad knows Dan from decades ago when Dan was a CIA operative in the Soviet-Afghan War. He consulted with the Afghan government, and he became close to Hamzad and Balor. Balor was Hamzad's wife, and she left with Dan to the United States and assumed the name Abbey Chase before marrying Dan. Hamzad is now an influential figure, and he's using this leverage to settle scores, including the personal and professional betrayal Dan perpetrated on him decades earlier. Harold says that he's helping Dan escape because the situation, while terrible for Dan, is also not good for Harold. After all, if he's captured, some things will come to light that he doesn't want people to know. Harold tells Dan that he needs to hide and never be found again. He should never contact his daughter Emily ever again. Harold explains that he will tell the CIA that Emily should be tailed, but when Dan never calls or never contacts her, they won't be able to find him. Dan hates this plan because he doesn't want to be disconnected from his daughter. Harold tells him not to fight the agents tailing him, because if he does so, Harold will be forced to track him down and take him out. Dan says he can't, and he hangs up and drives down a service road, turns his lights off, and the people tailing him find the transponder on the ground. They've lost him. The guys that were tailing him get out of their car and they begin looking for tracks. And just when they're doing this, Dan rams into their car, taking one of them out, and he ends up fighting the other guy hand to hand. The agent ends up zip tying Dan's hands and legs, and he puts him in the backseat of his car. Dan is able to get himself loose, and he kicks the guy, and the guy ends up crashing the car. Dan's dogs, who were following the car, end up catching up to it after the crash, and they take the other agent out. At this point, Dan is in bad shape, and he needs to recuperate. He steals a car and makes his way to an Airbnb, which his assistant set up for him. He's also not going by the name Dan Chase anymore. He's using Peter Caldwell. Because Dan unalived 2 agents the previous night, a red notice has been published, and a task force is being formed to chase him down, and it's led by Harold. Dan meets the Airbnb host, who lives on the property. Her name is Zoe McDonald, and Dan thought he was living on the property that didn't have its owner on site, because the phone number was outside of that area code. This presents a problem for Dan, because he was hoping not to be seen by anyone. Another problem arises when she sees Dan's dogs. The listing said no dogs. Zoe wants him to leave the rental because her ex-husband is the one that owns the property still, and she doesn't want the dogs doing any damage to it. Dan, however, is able to convince her to stay after he cooks her a meal and speaks with her. She lets him stay mostly because she needs the money, but also because she wants the company. Harold now visits a man named Morgan Botti, who is a powerful and influential player in the intelligence community. Harold tells Botti he's worried that Hamzad will get information from Dan, which will lead him to himself. Botti also has an interest in burying this problem, so he gives Harold the phone number of an assassin named Julian Carson. Dan and Zoe begin getting close, and they start dating. They are pulled over one night, and that information ends up in Harold's hands. Harold calls Julian, and he gives him Zoe's location, background information along with pictures from the night when they were pulled over. Dan informs Zoe that he needs to go to Montana, and he invites her to go along with him. Dan then asks Zoe why she protected him when the cops pulled him over and asked him for his ID. She knows that they were looking for him, and he reveals that he fought in a war but on the wrong side of the border, and that made him a target by the US government. At this point, we learn that Harold's assistant Angela is really Emily, Dan's daughter. She talks with Zoe about her father. After this conversation, she decides not to leave with Dan, and she begins to leave the house. But she hears something, and she goes back to look at it. And she discovers Dan fighting with Julian. Zoe goes to Dan's car, and she lets the dogs out, and they come in and they attack Julian, allowing Dan to get the gun he brought with him and take him out with it. But it doesn't kill him because he's wearing a bulletproof vest. As a result of this, Dan tells Zoe that he doesn't know who he can trust, and Zoe might not even be safe with the police. Back at the FBI offices, when discussing why Hamzat wants Dan so badly, Angela proposes that Harold and Waters ask Hamzat what he's looking for, because it might help them track Dan down. We see later that Dan took Zoe and put her in the trunk of his car. Dan brings Zoe to a different safe house that he owns, which is in Colorado. Julian calls Harold because he tells him that it seemed like Dan knew he was coming, because he was on his way out the door. This is shocking news to Harold because he doesn't see how Dan could have known this. Julian tells Harold that he must have a mole in the office. Harold, Angela, and Waters meet with Nina Kruger, Hamzat's attorney, because they want to see what he's trying to accomplish. Nina informs them that Hamzat's response is that he wants them to board a private plane to meet with him to discuss it in person. For obvious reasons, they don't really want to do this. Angela calls Dan and tells him that Hamzat wants them to board a plane, and Dan is very much against her boarding that plane. However, Angela and Harold end up boarding the plane, but Waters stays at home. By this time, Harold realizes that Angela is really Emily, Dan's daughter, and she's the mole. He says that she's the worst security breach in FBI history. Harold is very hurt by this news because he now sees Angela as almost a daughter at this point. Flashback to Afghanistan 30 years ago, and we see Hamzat's men torturing a Russian named Pavlovich. Belor is worried that the man being tortured will reveal that she has been working with him, so she gets Dan to help the man escape. Belor has been giving the Russians intel on rival Afghanistan leaders, so her husband is able to get the upper hand. She also has become aware of a very valuable mine, which could make Hamzat a king if he were to possess it. Eventually, the plane that Harold and Angela are on lands in Tunisia, or at least that is where Harold thinks they are, and they're both confused at this point because they don't know why they've been asked to arrive there. Dan and Zoe end up flying to Tunisia as well because Dan realizes the only way to stop Hamzat is to take him out at this point. Dan meets with Pavlovich, the man he saved 30 years ago. When he meets with Pavlovich, he tells him that Nina Kruger visited him earlier that day and told him that if he handed Dan over to Hamzat, he'd be in his good graces. Pavlovich is scared of Hamzat, and because of this, he plans to turn Dan over, but Dan overwhelms his guards and is able to escape by boat to the mainland. We flash back again to Afghanistan, and Hamzat is furious with his wife for helping Pavlovich escape. She also tells him about the valuable mine, but she says she won't tell him where it is because she doesn't want him to be a tyrant. This is what forced both Dan and Belor to flee to the United States, because Hamzat was going to take them out over this betrayal. Back to present day, Harold and Angela arrive at a train station, and Harold recognizes a man named Romani. Angela reveals that Romani is there to take Harold back to the States. However, instead of this happening, Julian, along with Romani, capture Angela to seemingly convince Dan to give himself up to Hamzat. Julian is working with Waters and presumably the CIA to make sure that Hamzat is able to capture Dan. They're holding Angela as leverage to make this happen. Dan doesn't think he can do anything else now that they have Angela, so he agrees to give himself up. Harold and a convoy then drive Dan in the direction of an airfield. Waters and Julian realize that someone is surrounding their hideout, where they are keeping Angela. Harold and Dan learn of this, and they realize that Hamzat is now trying to capture Angela for himself. Julian's associate and Waters try to leave the hideout in a van with Angela, but they are both killed, and Angela is taken. At this point, Dan reveals something that Harold didn't know when he and Belor left Afghanistan 30 years ago. They brought a third person with them, Hamzat and Belor's daughter. Angela is really Hamzat's daughter, and while he's been trying to capture Dan as well, it seems like the real target was Angela. The season ends with Angela being brought to Hamzat's location in Afghanistan. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.